Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I believe is that although, of course, there's a lot of hype around artificial intelligence, that I do believe that it does have the potential to transform healthcare and lead to huge benefits for our patients. And I think we're going to start to see those, in this decade, in the coming years. One of the things that I also believe is that ophthalmology, of course, I'm biased in this regard, but I believe that ophthalmology is at the forefront of AI-enabled healthcare, and that actually can act as an exemplar for other medical specialties in this field. And so, over the course of the next hour, both in the lecture and in the questions and answers, I hope to kind of try and convince you of that point. And really interested to take questions at the end. The other thing just to say is that in the bottom right there, I've included my Twitter handle. That's because I'm always like trying to get more followers on Twitter. So if anybody is interested, please catch me there. And then the other thing is that on my last slide, I'll include my email address. And so if anybody wants to get in contact with me via that way, then I try to answer all my emails. So as Ellen has said, my background is that I'm a consultant ophthalmologist at Moorfields Eye Hospital. Moorfields Eye Hospital is the oldest eye hospital in the world, and it is the largest eye hospital in either Europe or North America. So actually, just by way of reference, we see more than twice the number of patients per year than the largest center in the US. So really quite proud to work at Moorfields. Now, at Moorfields, I specialize in the treatment of retinal diseases. So in particular, things like age-related macular degeneration, or AMD, and diabetic eye disease. Now, I'm also an associate professor, as Alan has said, at UCL, at the Institute of Ophthalmology. And although I'm not a computer scientist or not an engineer and don't really have any sophisticated technical expertise, I have somehow found myself leading a kind of diverse, multidisciplinary research group that aims to develop and apply AI in healthcare. And as I've said, using ophthalmology as an exemplar. And the other thing that I should acknowledge is that I'm very privileged to be funded by UK Research and Innovation as a Future Leaders Fellow. And so this means that essentially I have 80% of my time protected for research. So I spend 1 day a week in clinic and the rest doing research. And I think that has been a key factor in allowing me to have meaningful collaborations with computer scientists and people in other academic fields. Now, given the nature of what I'm going to discuss over the next hour, I think it's also important that I just tell you about some financial disclosures. And so one of these is that I have acted as an external consultant for the artificial intelligence company DeepMind. And I'm a massive fan of DeepMind, but if I get overly enthusiastic in the next hour, please bear in mind that I do have that financial bias. And then I've also acted as an external consultant for Roche Genentech. So really what I'd like to cover in this lecture is probably spend about 2/3 of the lecture just talking about the Moorfields DeepMind collaboration and sort of telling you a little bit about how it came about, why it came about, how we sort of got to our first proof of concept studies, and then tell you in particular a little bit about our sort of continuing journey to try and go from code to clinic. And one of the major lessons that I would try to convey is that it turns out that actually going from an idea to a proof of concept algorithm that you can publish in a journal or show at a conference is actually kind of relatively straightforward, should I say, compared to actually trying to get something that you can use in patients all around the world for meaningful interactions. And I'd be pleased to share some of my experiences with that so far. And then the other thing that I'd like to do in the last third is just kind of like a little bit of a thought experiment and maybe make some provocative speculations with you guys around what do I think is the emerging ecosystem for AI-enabled healthcare. And I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler, which is to say that I believe that people like myself, clinicians and domain experts, will play an increasing role in the identification of novel use cases and the kind of early stage development of these tools. So why do we need new technology and innovation? Why do we need AI and all the hype that goes with it in ophthalmology? Well, this is a figure that I love to show, particularly to to doctors from other medical specialties. And so basically what this shows is that since 2017, ophthalmology has surpassed orthopedics in the United Kingdom as the #1 busiest of all the medical specialties in terms of clinic appointments. So in fact, nearly 10% of all NHS appointments are for eyes, and that constitutes nearly 10 million appointments per year. And furthermore, that's a number that's rising like this. So, the brutal fact is that we're drowning in the number of patients that we need to see. And as a result of that, there are some patients that lose sight because they have delays in being seen and treated. And I think it's fair to say that this is a problem, not just in Moorfields, not just in the UK, but in Portugal, in Europe, and around the world. So, one of the things that I believe is that we can use new technology and innovation, in particular AI, to at least in part address some of these problems. Now, my entry into this field really began about 5 or 6 years ago, when I started to become aware of a lot of the excitement in the tech industry around deep learning, and something that the New York Times called the Great AI Awakening in 2016. And so I think this really stems back to the ImageNet Challenge win from Jeff Hinton and his team in 2012, and just the sort of increasing recognition that with the right computing resources and with the right data sets, that deep learning could actually be really powerful in areas as diverse as image recognition, image classification, speech recognition, foreign language translation, et cetera. And so really that was sort of 5 or 6 years ago, or maybe even up to 10 years ago. And then in the last 5 or 6 years, we've started to see deep learning increasingly applied for medical applications. And so I think one of the seminal papers in that regard was from Sebastian Thrun's lab, published in Nature in 2017. I'm sure many of the people, or all of the people listening, will be very familiar with it, but you can see it was featured on the cover of Nature, and it had lesions learned, AI powers detection of skin cancer from images. And essentially what they did in this paper was get about 130,000 images of skin lesions, and some of them were benign skin lesions and some of them were malignant, and they trained a neural network to make that classification. And the exciting thing then, at least from my perspective, was that when they evaluated this model on an independent test set, and they found that the performance of the model was on a par with, I believe it was 20 board certified US trained dermatologists in making this classification. Now, as you can imagine, this is something that is pretty kind of jaw-dropping result. And you imagine what dermatologists are thinking, what ophthalmologists, what other medical specialists are thinking, and imagine actually what the implications of this could be for our patients, most importantly in the future. Now, of course, a major caveat to what I've just said is that this system that they've described is really only now starting to be seen to be used in the real world. And so there's kind of as everyone will be aware, tons and tons of caveats around the excitement around this technology. So we started to see then also in parallel a lot of early applications in ophthalmology, and one of the first was a very influential paper from Google Brain, published in JAMA in 2016 from Gulshan et al. And essentially it was pretty simple concept, which is that they got hundreds of thousands of retinal photographs from patients with diabetes, and they trained a deep learning classifier to distinguish between referable and non-referable diabetic retinopathy. Now, ophthalmology has been at the forefront, and I guess one of the reasons that I feel that I can make that claim is that the first ever FDA approved autonomous AI system was in ophthalmology. and that was in 2018 for a system from a company called Digital Diagnostics, formerly known as IDX, for diabetic retinopathy referral. And then actually in August 2020, you had another autonomous AI system for diabetic retinopathy, this time from INUC, which was also received FDA approval. Another thing that I just want to highlight is that there's this tremendous interest in AI-assisted scientific discovery. And another influential paper from Google Brain came out in Nature Biomedical Engineering in February 2018. And essentially what they did in this paper is they downloaded all the retinal photographs from a big population-based cohort study called UK Biobank, a massive study in the UK that many of you will be familiar with. And essentially, they tried to predict cardiovascular risk factors using the retinal photographs. And they got sort of okay results, pretty good results, but probably not anything better than kind of what, conventional risk prediction models. But what was really interesting from that paper was that using deep learning, they could actually predict the age of the patient to within about 3 years from retinal photographs. And then even more interesting was that they could predict the biological sex of the participants using deep learning. Now you may say, well, who cares about that? I mean, there are easier ways to tell whether someone is a man or a woman than applying deep learning to their retinal photograph. But of course, the reason why ophthalmologists and people like me, retina specialists, got really excited about this is that although I've been looking, some would say obsessively at retinal photographs for 15 years or more, I cannot begin to tell whether it's a man or a woman just from a retinal photograph. And so this suggested to us that actually that using these neural networks, that we might be able to sort of dig out new insights about the biology of the retina, for example. Now, where I come into this is that in July 2016, my hospital, Moorfields Eye Hospital, initiated a research collaboration agreement with the artificial intelligence company DeepMind. Now, DeepMind need no introduction, but suffice to say that they were founded in 2012 in London, and in 2014 they were acquired by Google, reputedly for around £400 million. And the exciting thing from my perspective is that their headquarters is still based in London, in the King's Cross area, which is just 2 stops away from Moorfields on the Tube. And they are arguably one of the world's leading artificial intelligence companies. So basically, I got in touch with them in July 2015 and said, I'm a consultant ophthalmologist, we're doing thousands of eye scans per day or per week at Moorfields. There are people who are losing sight because they can't be seen and treated quickly enough. Can we work together to develop a deep learning system to try and address this issue? Now, so really, I mean, it doesn't take a genius to come up with that use case. And this was essentially applying deep learning to these types of retinal scans called OCT scans. And you can see an example here. This stands for optical coherence tomography. And OCT is a little bit like an ultrasound, but instead of measuring the echoes of sound waves, it measures the reflection of light. And in doing so, it gives very high resolution, 3-dimensional images of the human retina. And just to give you a reference point, the axial resolution of an OCT scan is about 5 micrometers. So it's actually an order of magnitude better resolution than something like an MRI or a CT scan. And currently at Moorfields, we do about 1,000 OCT volume scans per day. So we have a huge logistical problem in dealing with that, but we also have a huge opportunity in terms of artificial intelligence, because this is the perfect substrate for deep learning. Now, in August 2018, we published the first results of the collaboration with DeepMind. And this was tremendously exciting. It was published in Nature Medicine, and you can see there's more than 30 different co-authors in the paper. And this reflects the fact that this was really a multidisciplinary collaboration, and it required input from clinicians at Moorfields, from scientists at UCL, and from amazing computer scientists and engineers at DeepMind. And it really wouldn't have been possible without the contributions of all 3 of those groups. Now, not only was it published in Nature Medicine, it was featured on the cover. And then, of course, this being AI, you can't escape the hype around it. And so it was tremendously exciting that it got a lot of media attention. Now, I'm someone who, you know, I published a decent amount of papers, and I have to say that in my career to date, before this, you know, I published a lot of papers that I was really, really excited about, and I thought were just amazing pieces of work, but probably like 5 people read. Uh, and so actually, it was nice to kind of be able to see and disseminate your work more widely in this way. However, it was also a bit awkward, because the fact of the matter is that, leaving the hype aside, that we haven't saved the sight of millions of people. And in fact, even now in 2021, this system is not up and running yet in the real world. And so if anybody emails me after saying, can I come and visit Moorfields and see the AI in action? Then I have to say, well, actually, we're still kind of getting to that point. So again, we need to sort of balance our excitement, enthusiasm for this technology with some kind of appropriate caution and skepticism. Now, just to show you, this is the system in action. So this is a patient in their 40s with diabetes. There's a lot going on here, but essentially, if you look at the bottom row, you can see where in the bottom left, we feed in the raw OCT volume scan. We feed this into the first of 2 neural networks. So the first network is a segmentation network, and we've trained it essentially to automatically delineate about 10 or 15 different anatomic parameters in the retina. You can see those listed in the legend in the bottom right. And so in this case, it's delineating intraretinal fluid in the retina, which is something called macular edema. And then on the second row, it uses that segmentation to generate these kind of 2-dimensional heat maps, if you like, of the scans. And then that segmentation output, that intermediate representation, is then fed into a second neural network, which is a classification network. And that gives the outputs that you see in the top left. And so in this case, it's saying semi-urgent referral, and it's saying diagnosis probability, macular retinal edema, 98.5%. And so that's in line with what we would, you know, the national standards that we'd expect in the UK. The other thing to highlight as well is that we use ensembles for this, and an ensemble of 5 neural networks for both the segmentation and for the classification. And I think that that's useful in my kind of simplistic mind. That's a bit like asking, you know, if you've got a challenging case, asking, you know, a number of different experts for a second opinion on the case. So where are we with this? Well, I think what we're trying to do is to bridge what we call the AI chasm. And the AI chasm is a term that we kind of borrowed from the tech world, from an article that I read in TechCrunch a number of years ago. And essentially, this is the idea that, you know, if you're a tech startup and, you know, in the machine learning space, that it's one thing to do a cool demo and raise some kind of seed funding. It's a very different thing to actually move towards scalable deployment and kind of meaningful human AI interaction on a global basis. And if it's hard to do that in the context of a purely tech industry, then of course it's orders of magnitude more difficult in a field such as healthcare, which appropriately has much tighter regulations around the use of such systems. So I thought it would be fun to just share some tweets that happened recently. And so I happen to know one of the senior editors for The Economist, who's a guy called Ken Cukier. And some of you will have read his book called Big Data a number of years ago, and he's got another book out called Framers at the moment. But essentially, he developed a problem with his eyes, and he called me up, and I kind of talked him through and got him seen in Moorfields and got him sorted out. But he posted this kind of gently teasing tweet after his surgery, which was basically that he went to Moorfields and he had his surgery done. And as he was going through the system, he kept saying to the nurses and the doctors, like, where's the AI? You know, you know, he was maybe jokingly a little bit disappointed because he had heard so much about this world-leading AI system. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about, you know, his experience and some of my thoughts on this, he actually interviewed me for a few days after for his podcast called Babbage. And I explained why, you know, our system couldn't help his eye. part of the reason was that the condition he had was a different condition that our system deals with, but more broadly, I talked about the challenges and kind of in actually going into the real world in this setting. So what are those challenges? Well, I think one of the things that I've come to learn is one of the issues is around the technical maturity of these systems. And so, one of the things that we've done, and when I say we, I really mean the engineers at Google have done in recent years, is actually take the piece of experimental code that we used for the Nature Medicine paper in 2018 and rewrite that from the ground up. So essentially it becomes a cloud-based API that runs in a fraction of the time with a fraction of the computing power from the system that we reported initially. And then the other thing was that at Wired Health, in March 2019, before the pandemic, we did a live demo of that newly written system. So that was both kind of scary, but also exciting to actually have scans from a real live patient and run through the system in the Crick Institute where that was held at the time. So the analogy that I use, particularly when talking to non-experts, is just to say, look, the paper that we wrote in 2018, that's essentially like we've built a concept car or like a prototype car, and it beats the world land speed record, but it can only do that with like a team of like amazing engineers from DeepMind who are able to kind of tweak it and make that record-breaking attempt. And now we're trying to think about how we can convert this into a production car that actually can be safe and reliable for use by people all around the world. Now, aside from the technical maturity, I think the clinical validation is key. And I was pleased to play a small role in one of the first major systematic reviews and meta-analysis of deep learning in medical imaging. And really the sort of long story short with this is that we looked at about 14,000 papers or conference proceedings about deep learning in medical imaging. And of those 14,000, less than half of 1% were actually methodologically robust from a clinical validation standpoint. And so this highlighted to us the need that we need to get much more robust clinical trials and clinical validation of these systems. So one of the things that we're doing in the context of the DeepMind collaboration is that we're actually validating the algorithm now on data sets from all around the world. So we want to make sure that the algorithm that was trained on data from more fields, that it will work just as well in a patient with diabetes or macular degeneration in Accra in Ghana, or in Sao Paulo, Brazil, Mexico City, Mexico, Detroit, Michigan, or other places around the world. And hopefully watch this space for some of the results of that. Now, once you've got your clinical validation, though, the other major blocker is that you need to get regulatory approval, and you need to get FDA approval, which is the big one, I guess, or UK or European equivalents. And the thing is that requires thousands of pages of paperwork, and typically would require at least $1 million and possibly a lot more, and many years to get through that process. So that's probably one of the key bottlenecks in actually getting something into real world use. But even once you get your FDA approval, you have to sort of figure out who's going to pay for it. Are NICE going to approve it in the UK? Is the CMS going to pay for it, and at what level in the US? Are private insurance companies going to pay for it? And so there's considerable challenges around the economic models for some of these systems. And then, suppose you have a reimbursement plan ready, are healthcare professionals going to use it? Are the systables flexible enough to incorporate it? Now, at Moorfields, we're actually designing and building a new hospital in the King's Cross area in the next couple of years. And so we're already thinking about how we can have the appropriate flexibility in the design so that we can incorporate new pathways of care that AI will enable. And the other thing that we're particularly interested in is how we can better link hospital eye services with community optometry practices, and maybe even with GP practices, family doctor practices, and maybe even with the home in the future. Because for me, the promise of artificial intelligence in ophthalmology is really about how we can bring specialized expertise, world-leading expertise out of the hospitals into the community and into the home and closer to our patients. So I'd just like to tell you a little bit about a spin-off project that we've done with DeepMind as well, more briefly. But the preface to that is that we're really proud of the fact that our work has been patient-centered. Much of the work that I've described already was inspired by a patient of mine at Moorfields called Elaine Manna, who has age-related macular degeneration and has spoken very eloquently about her condition. And so, her and people like her really were able to kind of highlight to us the challenges and delays in being seen that patients sometimes faced. The other thing that they highlighted was this idea that if somebody has lost sight in one eye, that patients can typically become very stressed about the idea of the same eye disease developing in their good eye, because that would be the point where they really become kind of blind effectively. And so we got the ideas, could we develop a deep learning system that could somehow indirectly protect the good eye? Could we predict the future development of retinal disease in the good eye? And then maybe we could institute treatments that could potentially prevent that from happening, or at least mitigate it when it does happen. So in May 18th of last year, I remember it because it was my birthday, we published a second paper from the collaboration, which is about predicting the conversion to wet AMD using deep learning. And just to highlight that the joint first author in this paper was an optometrist from Moorfields called Reena Chopra, who really was, I think, the driving force and inspiration behind a lot of this work. So the setup in this paper was that we had patients diagnosed with wet AMD or exudative AMD in their first eye. They're referred for treatment of that first eye. And the nice thing is that when patients are receiving treatment over time for eye disease, we always image the fellow eye at every visit. So we then have a unique situation whereby we have a lot of longitudinal data before something bad happens, at least in some patients in the fellow eye. We can use that for predictive modeling. And so I'm not going to go into the details much here, but just to say we developed a deep learning system that could predict what we called imminent conversion, so imminent development of wet AMD in the good eye of these patients. Now, just to briefly show you the very high level results, this is the kind of main ROC curve from the paper. The main line to look at is actually not the orange line, but the blue line. And the thing was that with this paper, we had an AUC of in this blue line of 0.745, which is, of course, not particularly jaw-dropping, to say the least. But actually, I think that it's important that this highlights 2 points. The first is that we were trying to predict the future development of something that happened in less than 5% of cases in our kind of test set. So it's not a common event, and there's a sort of certain randomness in the development of this as well. And so, of course, deep learning is not magic and can't be suspicious if it could predict this with a 0.99 AUC. But the other key point is that actually the AUC is not a clinically meaningful metric. And so actually what we're interested in is choosing operating points on the ROC curve and then actually seeing how they translate to sensitivities and specificities and how that works in your real world use case. So actually we were particularly interested in what we called a conservative operating point. And essentially what this meant is an operating point with 90% specificity. Because if we wanted a future use case where we would consider prophylactic treatment of these patients that are going to imminently convert, then maybe we want to avoid false positives because we don't want to potentially intervene with the invasive treatment if there's going to be a high rate of false positives. So in this case, we have a 90% specificity, we have about a 33% sensitivity. And so, this actually could be useful in that subset of patients who are maybe at high risk of conversion. The other thing just to highlight in brief is that one of the things we always try and do in our studies, both with DeepMind and in my own group independently, is that we always try to benchmark against human performance. And so the interesting thing was that this was not a task that we knew whether humans could do. And so we got a range of human experts to do it. And it was kind of interesting and surprising that the human experts could predict imminent conversion, although the performance was not quite as good as the deep learning system, and also, of course, very variable between different experts, which would limit its real world applicability. So I think that this is exciting because I think that one of the first use cases around deep learning in medicine is going to be as identifying high-risk patients for progression that can then be enrolled into clinical trials. And I think that that's important because it mitigates against some of the weaknesses of deep learning. You know, essentially this sort of central idea that, you know, deep learning is pretty good when it encounters data that's similar to the distribution of its training data, but not so good if that's not the case. And of course, in medicine, which is such an open-ended world, we're always seeing new cases almost every day, and things that have us scratching our heads, or there's always weird stuff going on, which is a kind of a weakness for these systems. Whereas I think in a clinical trial recruitment use case, you can actually kind of limit those to a certain extent. You can make sure that scans are only taken with a certain imaging device, they're only of a certain quality, they're only in a particular disease area, and that some kind of, you know, human oversight is possible as well. So that was the first 2/3, and the next sort of 10 minutes, just want to tell you a little bit about some ideas that I have for an emerging ecosystem for AI-enabled healthcare, and maybe kind of, as I said, make some comments that are a bit speculative, and maybe you know, some of the people listening, or maybe all of you, might feel that I'm actually saying crazy stuff, and that's okay if that's the case, and we can kind of touch on that in the questions and answers. But I'd like to begin with a thought experiment. So back in 2016, when we were first hearing about the great AI awakening with regard to deep learning in the New York Times, what would it have taken to do a really world-class deep learning project in healthcare, such as the one that, you know, we've described? Well, I would put it to you that actually compute resources was a major factor. And so, you know, you see graphs like this from OpenAI talking about how, you know, all these amazing world-leading breakthroughs, whether it's in, you know, in playing Go or in doing prediction of protein folding, required huge amount of computing resources. In fact, this graph shows a 300,000-fold increase in the resources for these cutting-edge applications over the last decade. So I think you needed access effectively to GPUs, and the more the better. And of course, you know, back 5 or 6 years ago, a lot of the high performance computing in universities wasn't really set up for that, for deep learning. And then of course, in hospital settings where the data actually lies, it's still kind of a rare thing to have access to GPUs. The other thing I think you needed was probably just, or more important, was you needed a lot of specialized technical expertise. So I remember at the time reading these sorts of articles, again, New York Times or in The Economist or similar, talking about how a lot of the time, at least back 2014, 2015, 2016, a lot of people with specialized expertise in deep learning were being snapped up by big companies, your Facebooks, your Googles, etc. And it was harder to find that expertise in an academic setting, although I think that that's maybe not so much the case anymore. And so what I would say then is, in 2021, what do you need to do to do a deep learning project in ophthalmology, for example? Well, I think in terms of compute resources, a lot of things have changed now, potentially because of the cloud. And we're all, in our personal lives, everything is linked to the cloud for the majority of people, whether it's our smartphones or our laptops. And the exciting thing in the UK, at least, was that in 2018, NHS Digital gave national guidance, actually, you know, supporting the use of cloud for NHS clinical data. And then we start to see a lot of major healthcare systems moving to the cloud. So the national e-referral system, which deals with 18 million appointments per year, is on Amazon Web Services. You've got the blood and transplant service, which uses Microsoft Azure. And so, you know, I feel that it's inevitable, really, that you know, healthcare institutions will move towards cloud-based IT infrastructure, and we already see some major centers in the US starting to move in that direction. The other thing, though, is around technical expertise, and you know, one of the things that I was most excited about, particularly as a non-computer scientist, was this article that came out from Cade Metz in 2017, where he talked about you know, these automated machine learning systems that have increasingly been developed. And the fact that the major tech companies all now have these sort of minimal code or code-free platforms that have drag and drop interfaces that essentially allow you to train image classifiers with minimal, if any, coding expertise. And so when I saw this, I just got really excited, because maybe this was a chance for me to kind of like, you know, do some of the things that, you know, my collaborators with AI expertise have been able to do over the last few years, at least in some simple sense. And so I think that this has potential to transform the AI ecosystem. And so a lot of the work that I've done so far, as I've described, has been with industry. In the last couple of years, working increasingly with academia and, you know, amazing people like Danny Alexander at the Center for Medical Image Computing at UCL and others. But actually, I think that increasingly researchers in my group and elsewhere are going to be clinicians who actually will kind of play a much more important role in this kind of research. So when we read this article in the New York Times, we immediately downloaded 5 public medical image data sets. We got skin cancer lesions, we got chest x-rays from adults and from kids, we got OCT scans, we got diabetic retinopathy retinal photographs. And the amazing thing is that we started using these platforms and we started to get results that were comparable to state of the art within days or weeks using these platforms. Now, lots and lots of caveats to that, but exciting nonetheless. Now, we published the results of this in the Lancet Digital Health at the end of 2019. And one of the things that happened in the review process for this that I can't resist sharing with you, and you know, it raised a smile for me, was that at the final revision stage, the editor-in-chief of the Lancet Digital Health said to us, one point that we hope you will be able to address in the revision is to emphasize that these tools will not necessarily replace AI experts. And I couldn't help but smile, because over the last 5 years, whenever I talk to doctors or nurses or other healthcare professionals about AI, the inevitable question is, will AI replace doctors? And of course, I'm excited about AI, but I'm very aware of its limitations in its current form, and that, you know, it's not going to replace healthcare professionals anytime soon. And that's equally the case, I would say, in the field of artificial intelligence. And I don't think that we're going to solve artificial general intelligence anytime soon. So there are much of our initial work with these automated deep learning platforms has been with AutoML Vision from Google, but actually there's multiple platforms from all the big companies and from a few smaller companies as well. And so in March of this year, we actually published a study in Nature Machine Intelligence where we compared each of these platforms, where, you know, the ones from Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, and a couple of others. And then we're also really interested in seeing if we can replicate high-profile clinical AI papers, but with our limited coding expertise. And so actually just last month, we published a paper in Scientific Reports where we replicated the paper that I told you from Google Brain in 2018, where they predicted biological sex from retinal photographs. Well, we were able to replicate it with minimal coding expertise and using these platforms. And so one of the things that we're really trying to do in the coming months is to take other seminal clinical AI papers and try and do the same, and see in some cases if we can actually exceed the performance of some of these landmark papers. So I'm excited about this because I think it could be what Steve Jobs called a bicycle for the mind. And this is an advertisement for the Apple II computer from August 1980, which I love. And you know, the text is going to be too small for you to read, but it's well worth kind of digging it out on the internet, because actually it describes a time that I think many of us or all of us would probably forget, which is a time when the idea of a personal computer seemed crazy. And you know, the mainstream computing industry in the 1970s was actually very skeptical of personal computers. So you had these famous quotes from people like Ken Olsen from Digital, who said, there is no reason why anyone would want a computer in their home. Because remember, at the time, computers were mainframes or mini computers that were used by corporations to do their payroll, or used by the military to plot ballistic missile trajectories and so on. And they couldn't really conceive at the time that the primitive computers that were being made in garages in Palo Alto would actually be of any interest or of any use for the kind of general public. And of course, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak and others had the vision to see that that wasn't the case. And so actually, I think that as we democratize some of these tools for deep learning, I think it could have the same potential. And so, you know, I would say we could enter an era where we have a lot more domain expert driven exploration of these technologies. And so when I'm talking to clinicians, I say, if not you, then who? If you're interested in this, you know, just go and download a public data set, sign up to the free tier of one of these platforms and just start to experiment with these. Now, the interesting thing is that there are a number of members of my research group who actually are computer scientists and have PhDs in machine learning and are amazing from a technical perspective. And sometimes actually they find themselves now using some of these AutoML systems to just quickly train a model. They don't have to worry about the specifics, but it's like they can quickly make a tool for use to facilitate other research. So for an example, suppose somebody gives you 100,000 retinal photographs and you don't know which is a left eye and which is a right eye. You could just quickly train an AutoML model to distinguish between the two and then, you know, generate labels for that. Or you might want to generate an image quality model or something similar. So just to flag, Eddie Korat and Kira Byrne are some of the members of my group that are actually kind of like really kind of pushing the envelope in this field. So just to finish up my last two slides, I would say there may be some people who are probably horrified at what I'm sort of suggesting around the democratization of this technology. And certainly there's lots of caveats to what I've just said. And, you know, I think that, training the model is only one part of this kind of machine learning pipeline. And there's lots of ways that, a clueless clinician could go wrong if they're not aware of a lot of basic principles. Things like, leakage of data between training and test sets, class imbalances and so on and so forth. So actually, even if you're skeptical about kind of some of the kind of explorations that I've just said, I think one of the other big applications for these automated tools could be around medical education. And so I was really excited to be able to write an essay about this in the Lancet that was published just a couple of months ago with one of my heroes, Eric Topol, and essentially just describing how, maybe the best way to teach medical students and junior doctors about AI would be to, sign them up to one of these platforms, give them some public medical images and just allow them to get a sense of how these models are trained and where the mistakes and where the bear traps are. Another thing that I would say kind of related to that is that I do believe that one of the biggest impacts of AI in healthcare in the coming years is going to be around education of clinicians in terms of making them better diagnosticians, better doctors. And so, I've really been influenced by reading Gary Kasparov's book called Deep Thinking, and particularly the last chapter of that book where he describes what happened after he lost to Deep Blue. And he says, people didn't stop playing chess after, chess computers became better than humans. But in fact, actually, they started to use these chess computers to train. And then, of course, that had a number of knock-on effects. So in particular, he highlights that nowadays you have more grandmasters at a younger age than before. And you also have a much broader geographical distribution of chess playing talent. And so I think that we could see something similar in healthcare, where I'll bet you that if you took a bright medical student or even an allied healthcare professional and just said, look, here's a large data set and here's an AI system that will give you real-time feedback as you make kind of diagnostic decisions on it. And then here's some sort of teaching algorithm that presents you with cases that you haven't seen before, that actually they could probably become as good or better than someone like me in a fraction of the time that it's taken me to become a so-called expert in interpretation of these images. So just to conclude then, I hope that I've begun to build a case over the last hour that, there is this great potential and there's this great need for technologies such as deep learning to try to reinvent the way that we do eye examination, and take things such as the slit lamp biomicroscope, which is a technology that's changed, really hasn't changed in more than 100 years, and kind of like totally reinvent the way that we approach eye examination for the 21st century. And so lastly, as promised, that's my email address. I try to answer all my emails. If I don't answer, it's probably gone into spam. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much.